Vice-Chancellor, General Paidas, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It was the Dutch philosopher, Baruch Spinoza, who in the 17th century said that peace means much more than the mere absence of war. And I'd like you to think about this over the next 15 minutes or so while I speak. Peace, or to use another term, security, therefore should be understood not only in terms of avoiding war. Real peace or real security is about establishing an active culture of living in peace in the world. And it is with this quote in mind that I turn to the issue of ensuring security through sustainable development from a Pacific perspective. By way of background to the topic, the end of colonialism in the Pacific brought forth a generation of local island leaders characterised by nationalism, elitism and ambition, but little practical experience and few institutional constraints. A colonial generosity and post-colonial aid then fostered bloated government sectors and expensive public projects such as buildings for administration, education and health, sports stadiums and ports and airports. As governments became lucrative employers amidst traditional ethnic and family systems, nepotism flourished. Mismanagement, corruption and theft escalated. Heavy demands by metropolitan governments and international agencies were imposed on relatively inexperienced island leaders and administrators to achieve the ideal of good governance. But these clashed with traditional order. The erosion of family values was not balanced by a growth of civil society and public ethics, resulting in a rise of personal greed, petty authoritarianism, and dysfunctional bureaucratism. These in turn eroded respect for government and law, precipitated frustration amongst the disempowered, and led to regular violence. Turning to economic problems, the rhetoric of independence fostered inflated expectations which were not able to be fulfilled. Most new island governments adopted free market policies and welcomed investment. Plantations and foreign or local well-connected elite entrepreneurs displaced smallholders and artisans, exacerbating the problem of unemployment. Growing tourism favoured foreign enterprises and in some cases alienated local people from their own lands and waters and trivialised their culture. Preventive medicine produced rapid population growth, but the distribution of land, assets and jobs did not keep up. These trends produced land shortage, a widening rich-poor gap, growing poverty, and a divide between the urban centres and the outlying villages and islands. In the modern sector, globalisation was a mixed blessing. Over time, demand and prices fell for primary commodities exported by the island's economies. Manufacturing never developed. Island governments were caught between rising costs and shrinking tax bases and other sources of revenue, and laid off officials to remain solvent. This and general joblessness led to the immigration of energetic and skilled youth to New Zealand, Australia and the United States. The result was the dependency of many of Pacific Islands on aid, loans and remittances. But if these political and economic problems remained local and minor, they could be dealt with by benign neglect, selective aid, generous migration access and episodic law enforcement. But during the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet Union offered aid and other economic benefits to island governments in return for port access and diplomatic ties. Western governments were obliged to make economic counteroffers and pay more attention to local political demands in order to maintain their collective influence in the Pacific region. Upon the end of the Cold War rivalry, some analysts predicted a lapsing of interest in the region by the West, and to some extent that occurred. But new rivalry stimulated new interest and to some degree new aid and other assistance. These included the rivalry between China and Taiwan, who vied for diplomatic recognition by island microstates and were willing to pay for it. Japan as well took a renewed interest in the islands as part of its drive to become a normal nation and play a larger role on the international stage, and of course to avoid taking second place to China. Malaysia and Singapore also became modest aid donors, and these new opportunities attracted the attention of those island leaders, particularly in Fiji, hoping to moderate New Zealand, Australian and American influence. Despite these new sources of aid and diplomatic support, specialists on island affairs became aware that the political and economic problems discussed previously were not diminishing, but rather were growing and generating insecurity in the Pacific Islands. Furthermore, these rising security threats had the potential to impact on the metropolitan countries, principally Australia, New Zealand and the United States. These security threats stemmed from the incapacity of island governments to manage their assets and generally to keep financial, social and physical order. When this incapacity grew to alarming proportions, Western analysis characterised it as political and administrative failure. Other governments suffering from the syndrome, mainly in Africa, became known as failed states, and the term was soon appropriated by both Australian and New Zealand analysts to describe situations of turmoil in the Pacific. The rise of terrorism in the Middle East and internationally in the 1990s heightened fears that failed states anywhere could become havens for terrorist cells, often financed by criminal enterprises that could proliferate globally. While no terrorists were known to operate in the Pacific Islands, transnational criminals and drug networks were massive. And the islands were adjacent to the Philippines and to Indonesia, where terrorists were active, so the migration of terrorists was a real possibility. Even in the absence of terrorists, the questionable banking and immigration policies of island governments could facilitate the movement of funds or persons associated with terrorist networks. So as we can see, governing capacity in many post-colonial Pacific countries has, and it continues to deteriorate, giving rise to the concept of failed states. By way of regional response to this, New Zealand and Australia at first grounded their policies on the assumption that local leaders and societies could, with a little aid and encouragement, manage security and development. Unfortunately, they later reconsidered this assumption in light of practical experience. Policies have moved from optimism and generosity to doubt, adjustment and reassessment, and finally to activism and occasional intervention in the Pacific. While military force to restore order has proved effective at first, longer-term improvements in security will need to include substantial, sustainable development initiatives. And this gives rise to what we are calling the security development nexus. Now, the broader debate around security, and particularly the security development nexus, is very relevant to understanding a number of situations that have arisen in the Pacific in recent years. But what do we actually mean by the term security? And this is a word that we've struggled with over the last couple of days. Well, recently the Copenhagen School and the critical security approach, to mention two significant influences, have encouraged a broadening of the definition of security away from the traditional emphasis on the protection of the state through military means. With their definition, security involves not only the protection of the territorial integrity of a state, but also the upholding and enhancing the well-being of people coming within the jurisdiction of that state. So if we accept this as a definition, following on from this, the security development nexus suggests that long-term security must be based on a development strategy that is appropriate to the needs of the developing country. In broad terms, this strategy must address economic issues, whether they are construed in terms of either poverty reduction or the reduction of inequality, but it must also deal with issues of the strengthening of institutions and those of group relationships. Now, the Solomon Islands provides us with an interesting and useful case study on the security development nexus. So the Solomon Islands, as you can see there in the Pacific, is a series of islands that achieved some prominence as a security issue in the Southwest Pacific in June 2000 when a coup was mounted against the incumbent government. The background to the coup was the growing tensions on Guadalcanal between people from that island and immigrants from the neighbouring island of Malaita. People from Guadalcanal resented the way in which Malaitans had acquired land and benefited economically from being on Guadalcanal. These tensions were exacerbated by the restricted opportunities in the Solomon Islands. There were concerns about the impact of the Solomon situation on regional stability, although humanitarian concerns were also relevant. The coalition government in Australia thus responded favourably to a request from the Solomon Islands Prime Minister for assistance. So with regional approval from the Pacific Islands Forum and formal consent from both the government and Parliament of the Solomon Islands, the Regional Assistance Mission to the Solomon Islands, or RAMSI as it was known, commenced in July 2003. Operation Help 'em Friend was essentially a military and policing operation in its initial phase. It was focused heavily on restoring law and order in the Solomon Islands, but it also had a strong emphasis on the issues of government administration and finances. In the short term, the intervention proved successful in restoring law and order. However, the intervention remains ongoing and the situation remains fragile, and there are uncertainties as to whether the underlying problems that contributed to the breakdown of law and order have actually been addressed. Beyond the initial phase, therefore, it has been realised that a long-term approach to achieving security in the Solomon Islands would require some attention to the issue of sustainable development. But again, we ask the question, what is sustainable development? And we ask this question because the development strategies that are generally pursued, particularly by the West and particularly when external actors are involved, do not necessarily ignore the local level, but are mostly biased towards the centre. So these development strategies are focused on institutional and structural reform at the government level. The problem with this is that an emphasis on state building at the centre is likely to create a fragile structure which lacks deep roots in society. This is certainly the case in the Solomon Islands, and the main criticism that has been levelled at the mission is that it has focused too much on developing the central state, and in doing so has neglected other sources of traditional power and legitimacy, which are extremely important in Pacific societies, as I'm sure they are in many other societies. But by doing this and attempting to build a Western-style, modern state in the Solomons, the long-term sustainability of security is suspect, and we risked winning the war but losing the peace. So the argument proposed here, therefore, is that while a military intervention can contribute to the achievement or restoration of security in the short term, a long-term security requires the implementation of an effective development strategy that is focused on the underlying causes of the breakdown that has occurred. So no surprises thus far. But while external actors and the military political machine tend to focus on top-down state building, and don't get me wrong, this is important, particularly in terms of a whole-of-government approach, local actors need to take the lead and need to be encouraged to take the lead in promoting a bottom-up, nation-building or whole-of-society approach. Further, I would argue that these two processes of nation-building and state-building must be linked, and they must create an integrated approach to sustainable development. It is only when we do this that it is likely to result in much greater legitimacy for both the state but also for the people, and thereby enhancing both state and human security in the longer term. Now, the obstacles in moving in such a direction are clearly very significant. But by doing this, what we will do is acknowledge that peace means far more than the mere absence of war. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time.